Hello, bonjour à tous et bienvenue à l'atelier national de ARPIC, jour 2 séance. Welcome to ARPIC's National Workshop Day 2 sessions. This session is Update and Outlook by the Center for Greening Government. A reminder that during the session, if you think of some questions, please enter them in the Q&A, which is located at the center bottom of your screen, and we will answer questions after the session. Our presenter is Nick Sinos. He's the Executive Director of the Center for Greening Government within the Treasury Board Secretariat. The center is working with federal departments and agencies towards low carbon, sustainable, and climate resilient government operations, with a large focus on greening real property. Previous to this position, he worked on climate change impacts and adaptation, policy and infrastructure framework related to Arctic science and infrastructure policy more broadly. So we're happy today to have Nick presenting for us as the Executive Director of TBS. Welcome, Nick. We're ready to hear what you have to say.
Merci beaucoup, Luann. Thank you very much. Really happy to be here. I'm just going to share my screen here. Can you see that? Excellent. So very happy to be here today to give you an update on what's happening on the greening government strategy and pathways to net zero for all of the real property folks. I'll give a bit of a context, policy context, and then we'll get into some of the specifics of the greening government strategy. So as you know, very topical these days. With COP26 happening, we know that there's a lot of discussion on climate change, and you've seen or you've read a lot about the climate change discussions happening globally. You've heard the urgency that we need to get to net zero for the planet, and you've heard about the impacts of climate change already happening to us. So what's important, what I wanted to give you a bit of that policy context right now. The Government of Canada has an overall climate change plan. It's called A Healthy Environment and a Healthy Economy, and it fits within and is in line with the International Paris Agreement to go to net zero. So the climate change plan of the Government of Canada says we got to be net zero. And part of that climate change plan of the Government of Canada is the Greening Government Strategy. It's a component of it. And the Greening Government Strategy says that the government in its own operations, including its real property, is going to get to net zero carbon by 2050. And really focusing in on, and the real property is quite an important component here, because as you've heard on the DM panel and you've heard over the last couple of days, real property is really at the center of greening. So you're all champions on the climate action front, and you can all tell your kids that you're at front and center on taking action on climate change. And I'll go into a bit more detail how. I'll also mention greening government is one of the objectives under the Federal Sustainable Development Strategy. And we also, the Center for Greening Government at Treasury Board, who we're in charge of coordinating the implementation of the Greening Government Strategy, is also in charge of the policy on green procurement. So what is the Greening Government Strategy? How does it look like? What does it look like? So the Greening Government Strategy was approved by this government as its main strategy to green its own operations, because of course, if we're asking Canadians to be net zero and take climate action, then we have to do it in our own backyard. And what's government operations? How do we reduce our environmental footprint? Well, we're going to take action in different areas: real property, fleet and mobility, procurement, and climate resilient operations. So that's the 4 pillars of the Greening Government Strategy. And the overall target is to be net zero emissions by 2050, and for real property to reduce emissions by 40% by 2025. And then overall to be green and climate resilient. And I'll go into more details on that. And us at Treasury Board, the Center for Greening Government, we provide direction, guidance, something called the Greening Government Fund. And we set the direction. But of course, expert departments, we rely on them heavily. So whether that's Natural Resources Canada, Public Services and Procurement Canada, Environment Canada, National Research Council, et cetera, we rely heavily on the expertise and the technical expertise in departments to help develop that direction and guidance. And then of course, departments are the heroes. They're the ones that actually take action on their buildings and green them. And a lot of the other components of the strategy, whether it's mobility or procurement, relate a lot to real property. Like if you think about transportation, it's really about how we get to one built environment, from one built environment to the other. That's, I mean, essentially we're moving from one building to another and how we do that. And so where those buildings are and how they're designed is actually quite important in helping enable good, greener transportation. And procurement similarly also relates a lot to real property, because a lot of things we buy actually end up filling our built environment spaces. So, and then the climate resilient is really important to make sure that our resilience to what's happening with climate change, that our built assets are resilient to that. And we've learned a lot about resilience in COVID, and that applies a lot to real property as well. So now we can all telework, we're not attached to a fixed built environment, built a building. Similarly, if that building gets flooded or there's wildfires, et cetera, then we've increased our resilience to extreme weather. So far, I'm happy to say we're close to 35% reduction in emissions for buildings. And so we've had good progress, but of course we got a ways to go, and it gets harder as we keep going. I'll give an overview of where our emissions come from in those different business line areas. And this is, it kind of gives a nice insight on where we can take action. The first thing I'll say is that the government owns over 30,000 buildings, about 32,000 buildings, 20,000 engineering assets. We own 30,000 fleet, and we buy over $18 billion a year. So we're the largest asset owner and public procurer in Canada. So again, if we're asking Canadians to be green, then we need to do it ourselves. If we commit as the government of Canada to a biodiversity convention internationally, then we need to mirror that ourselves. If we commit to reducing plastic waste internationally, then again, we need to do it ourselves. And we need to do it ourselves because we're one of the biggest players in the country. So with the most technical expertise, and even though it doesn't feel like we have a lot of resources some days, we still have more resources than the average Canadian who's thinking about how to green their house and or their transportation. So, si on regarde nos gaz à effet de serre, ça nous donne un bon survol de où sont nos gaz à effet de serre et où est-ce qu'on peut prendre l'action. So these pie charts give a good overview. So on the top left here is really our main direct emissions, and that's from buildings. And most of it is from heating buildings. So really it's natural gas heating for the most part, a little bit of oil, but mostly natural gas heating. That's where the emissions come from buildings, is our heating and cooling systems, and mainly heating in Canada. And then our electricity, and that powers the buildings. But in a lot of provinces, the electricity is zero carbon. 80% of our grid is actually zero carbon in Canada. So really the electricity emissions are coming mostly from the provinces like Alberta, Saskatchewan, Nova Scotia, and part of New Brunswick, where the grid is not zero carbon. And then, below here is our national safety and security fleet, so aircraft and marine, but we know that the buildings we have support a lot of those things. When you have a 6 Hercules hangar, then you're supporting your aircraft. When you have docks and naval infrastructure, if you will, port infrastructure, then again, you're supporting that. So again, the buildings are key to that. And then on a procurement, we've done a study. These are estimated on the right. On the left, they're exact numbers, but on the right, we estimated what's emissions from the things we buy. And this is emissions to make the things we buy and to provide us our services. And if you look at some of the biggest categories of emissions, it's things like construction, which are directly related. So think cement, steel, asphalt. Those have huge carbon footprints. And then various equipment and things as well. So, and then other indirect emissions include commuting, which these would have gone down quite a bit with COVID, and then air travel emissions. So you could see that the built environment affects a lot of our emissions. All departments are not equal in terms of the RP footprint. We all know that. So here you can see that if you look at the emissions from our buildings, what's the footprint of the government of Canada? A big part of it is defense, of course, because our defense bases are large, are some of our largest operational buildings, and they're really mini cities, if you will. So that makes sense. And then the second bar is PSPC, so it's office buildings. Third is correctional facilities. Fourth is RCMP detachments. And then a whole bunch of special purpose, a lot of labs, and then special purpose things like Parks Canada, ferries, border posts, and things like that. And on the web, we post how each department is doing and how their emissions annually. And you can see there's good progress there by the various departments on getting to our reduction of emissions. And when you think of direct emissions, then that are not military operations related, it's really about buildings. I'll go through a few of the commitments in the greening government strategy in a little bit more detail. So this requirement is for all departments that own real property, and it requires that new builds be net zero carbon. Because if they're not net zero carbon to begin with, then we're going to need to retrofit them because those buildings are going to be around 2050. So if we're committing to be net zero by 2050, then the buildings need to be net zero now. And it's actually cheaper to put it in the design in the first place than to have to retrofit a really costly retrofit of the building down the road. So new builds being net zero carbon, and what that usually means is there's a little bit more in capital and you make it up on O&M over the life cycle of the building. We heard a lot about the fixed asset review today. And so the fixed asset review is got great recommendations, did some really good work. And for example, the fixed asset review recommends portfolio level plans, right? And so really when you do a portfolio plan for your buildings, what you want to do is have a net zero and climate resilient portfolio plan and make sure you integrate that component. So, you know, so as departments, we think about how we're going to get to net zero. And then every major transaction we do along the way for the next decades, we want to be in line with that instead of making decisions now and building liabilities that we then need to retrofit later. For retrofits, we recognize, of course, a retrofit is going to be more difficult to get to net zero and more costly. And what we've said is the strategy outlines that a shadow carbon price of $300 a ton should be used. So that will help in making decisions of what kind of heating system to have, what kind of HVAC system, how much to invest in insulation, in energy efficiency versus the HVAC system, versus fuel switching, et cetera. So these are the kinds of decisions that you can make using a $300 a ton carbon price. We also committed to buying 100% clean electricity by 2022 were available, and latest by 2025, working closely with PSPC. So we've gone out to market in the particular provinces and or have MOUs with utilities there. And so the electricity buying renewable, so we're gonna buy renewable electricity that will be newly produced and be fed into the grid to the equivalent of the amount we use. So, and that's actually a very cost-effective way to get your electricity down to zero carbon. And then the climate resilient design. So we need to know whether you're in a floodplain or not. You need to know, will it meet the future climate stresses, not the historic climate stresses. The wildfires in BC, I just saw a great presentation where a 1 in 1,000, normally is a 1 in 1,000 event, but in a 2 to 3 degree global warming world, that's going to be likely a 1 in 5 year event. So you can see that flooding, fires, sea level rise. So if you're building infrastructure along coasts, you need to design for the future, not historic. We've also got commitments here in leases, in biodiversity. We of course want to, again, meet our International Biodiversity Convention. We want to lease zero carbon spaces. I'm just reading in the paper, various real estate companies that are committing to zero carbon as well. In terms of water, waste, and material, we also have commitments. So on waste, we want to divert 75% of our non-hazardous operational plastic waste and eliminate single-use plastics, divert 90% of our construction waste. And in material, I'll go to the next slide here. Embodied carbon is an important part. So as I mentioned, it's about the carbon that it takes to make and transport things to us, right? The things we buy. So when you think about construction, making cement and steel and asphalt, for example, are really carbon intensive. So it's the raw materials, the transportation, the manufacture, and the transportation site and the construction. And then the electricity and heating we use is called the operating carbon. But then you also have to demolish it and you have to manage the waste. And all that is very carbon intensive. And so what we've committed to in the strategy as a government of Canada is we're going to disclose our embodied carbon, the carbon in making materials, by 2022 and reduce it by 30% starting in 2025. We're also, ISED's leading discussions with the cement and concrete industry, for example, to have a zero carbon roadmap. We've had discussions with the steel sector, for example. So how do we get our products to lower carbon, and how do, in our procurement, we start asking for lower carbon materials? Various departments did a study of how to get to zero carbon, sort of zero carbon roadmaps, if you will, and looked at different components. We then did a roll-up study of all of the key departments and said, as the government of Canada, this is the different things that will contribute to us getting to zero carbon. I'll just mention a few of the big ones. Deep retrofits, of course, and rebuilds for buildings, clean electricity procurement or fuel switching, so changing, going from natural gas to electrification of heating, let's say, for example, are all kind of examples of what we can do. In a lot of cases, we have central heating plants. So how do we update those plants and do it in a chronological way with upgrading of the buildings on the site, for example, is important. And this is where the different pathways, the roll-up study we did found that for some of our more bigger portfolios, $300 a ton was the average that it would cost. So that's why we've gone in that direction and picked that price. So again, when you look at various, and the other thing too, I should mention with this portfolio plan approach, is that you want to retrofit a building. You don't want to retrofit it just for green reasons. You're going to retrofit that building when its time comes to be retrofitted. And so what you want to make sure is you don't miss that opportunity to green that building. So if that building is going to be undergoing a deep retrofit in 10 years, then when you get there, you want to make sure you've planned for how to get it to as low carbon as possible, because you're only going to retrofit a building once in its 30-year time frame, and so you want to make sure you get it right. Zero carbon buildings are feasible now. We've got over 200 buildings that are zero carbon in the Government of Canada's portfolio, another 100 or so that are zero carbon ready. And really, it's about a mix of looking at the envelope, the HVAC systems, and then what's the energy source, whether it's going to be a fossil fuel or electrification or et cetera. So really, the mix of those three is really different for each building. So it really depends on your building, which one of those would you use? And that's why each study for each particular building is going to be, has to be specific to that building and look at your situation. But we have great examples. Library and Archives Gatineau 2 Preservation Center is under construction, is going to be zero carbon. And we've got other buildings here and zero carbon ready buildings on the next slide here. So really what it means is the buildings are as energy efficient as possible. And then you look at electrifying the heat and the HVAC system oftentimes, and then buy any clean electricity if the grid isn't clean. So that's kind of a classic model, but again, each building, the mix of that would depend on each building. So what's our plan going forward in terms of getting to zero carbon? Well, all of us, our job is to implement the greening government strategy commitments in each area. We're updating our guidance, but there is guidance on our GCpedia page, Treasury Board Secretariat, Center for Greening Government. And then we're embedding greening in relevant policies. So the policy suite review coming out of the controllership branch, the new directive on real property and on investment planning and on procurement, et cetera, material management, all embed greening and the greening government strategy in them. There's also the policy on green procurement. So they're all reflecting the same strategy and commitments. In terms of real property, really looking at, in terms of climate resilience and zero, you need to implement zero carbon climate resilient real property portfolio and investment plans as per the fixed asset review. And I'll just mention a little bit on resilience. We really want to do a bit of a heat map, and various departments, CBSA's got a really good model. They looked at the different facilities and looked at what are the kind of what are the heat map of the most critical assets they have, and how would they be resilient to increasing climate events, whether it's extreme weather, rain, urban wildfires, urban flooding, sea level rise, et cetera, and extra freeze thaw as well. And so how's the envelope handle that? And then how can you make changes to that, which will be cheaper than having to fix major repairs later? So implement it into the real property portfolio and investment plans. Look at zero carbon new builds and deep retrofits using the $300 a ton shadow price. And we're developing a tool in terms of using that. Your department, all departments are on board in terms of procurement of clean electricity. But really, when you look at your portfolio, what I'd suggest is focus on your biggest emitters and focus on the heating systems. That's really the big issues to look at. In terms of green procurement, we're implementing existing commitments to buy green buildings, green fleet, green electricity, and low carbon fuels. And we're developing new central requirements under the policy on green procurement to look at embodied carbon in key high carbon categories. In particular, we're looking at construction materials, cement, and then steel. We're also developing something on supplier disclosure. So in the strategy, it says incenting big suppliers to disclose their carbon and have a Paris-based target. We'd love to have our biggest suppliers to the government of Canada to make sure they disclose their carbon and also have a similar action plan as we do. And really, corporate Canada and worldwide, the biggest and greenest companies are doing this anyway. And then we're looking at IT and equipment and low carbon fuels for our ships and jets. And PSPC, of course, looking at greening their standing offers, so shared services, for example. So department's job, of course, to analyze their procurement spend, see where they spend the money, and then take action in their key categories. And usually real property is kind of one of the first ones. And then there's going to be a lot of categories that relate to real property as well. And then, of course, we want to roll out commitments for diverting waste, eliminating single-use plastics and plastic waste, looking at managing water well and biodiversity. Two funds that PSPC is delivering: the Clean Electricity Fund, and we're delivering a low carbon fuel procurement program. We have something called the Greening Government Fund. It's a small fund, but it invests in innovative projects, and a lot of them are related to real property. Basically, departments are charged on their emissions from their air travel, and then we have a central pot that we then fund departmental projects. So we're funding the National Research Council to look at embodied carbon in construction materials. There's projects at Parks Canada, and Natural Resources Canada, and a lot of other departments, defense, et cetera, looking at renewable energy, innovative new microgrids and storage in remote places and in big bases, heating plants. And there's projects, and there's a website you can go to on the Greening Government Fund to find out more. I'll leave it there. On a des résultats. Le dernier diapo parle un peu de nos résultats dans différents domaines que j'ai mentionnés. On a 200 édifices à net zéro. On a plusieurs départements ont développé des plans de zéro carbone pour leur immobilier. On a, avec Shared Services, on a augmenté. Quand on dit on, c'est vraiment on collectivement avec tous les ministères. On a augmenté le nombre de minutes de téléconférence et la flexibilité à nos employés de travailler de la maison. And we've heard a lot about the sort of hybrid work environment, et cetera. That, of course, becomes very green too, because you put less tax, you're taxing less city infrastructure at peak times, and you're making you're lowering the footprint in terms of the heating of buildings, commuting, et cetera. But also the land use planning and stuff that the city does is an interesting, what's going to be the impact of that longer term as well is an interesting area to look at. On achète des véhicules verts et incluant des véhicules de police qu'on est en train de tester. On veut que nos fournisseurs divulguent leur carbone et on fait des projets pilotes dans ce domaine-là. 90% de notre électricité vient déjà de sources propres. Alors, et on a des ministères qui prennent de l'action pour comprendre, faire des risk assessments, comprendre leurs risques et prendre des actions pour être résilients au changement climatique. Le Fonds pour un gouvernement vert a déjà supporté 27 projets. On divulgue toutes nos données, émissions de gaz à effet de serre par ministère, par édifice sur notre site web. Et on est à 35% maintenant pour les édifices. Alors, Je vais le laisser là. There's a bit more detail. We got lots of detailed and examples of charts and things, but I'll leave it there and happy to take questions and comments from the floor, I guess, for in our remaining time.
Oh, that sorry, my camera was reacting slowly. That was great. Thanks for that presentation, Nick. That definitely generated a few questions, so I'll start firing them your way. The first one was, does this mean that for new builds, the life cycle cost analysis does not apply?
So for new builds, our default is that it should be zero carbon, right? Like the cheapest time to make a zero carbon building is during a new build. And we do want a life cycle cost analysis as well, because what you want to do is show there's going to be probably a capital increase. And what you want to show is over the life cycle of the building, what that means. So stick with the guidance, and we have guidance in the area, and you'll want to stick with that, the guidance that we have on what we recommend. But you should aim for zero carbon for a new build. There might be some extreme cases of buildings that are really extreme cases where it makes more sense to be net zero ready, and that's fair, and that's where the life cycle analysis can make that case. But really, we should be looking at zero carbon for new builds.
Another one was, why is the renewable natural gas not considered carbon neutral except in Quebec?
Well, it depends in every jurisdiction. And like the general principle when you look at renewable energies is that they should be additive, right? Additional. So we don't want to take, so there's no simple answer in the sense you need to look at the life cycle of that renewable energy, and you need to look at to make sure it's additional. So if, for example, somebody's already producing the renewable natural gas and they're providing it, let's say, to a school board, and then that contract's up, and then we're willing to pay more as a federal government, and then they just give it to us, then that's not creating additional capacity in the system in that area. And so that's what we want to avoid, because we want to actually increase the capacity and the production of these things in the economy to make the economy greener, not just that we're displacing somebody else's renewable natural gas. So, and then of course, each, renewable natural gas, you need to look at kind of the source and the life cycle assessment of each of those to know, how green it is.
Okay. Is there a website or database which has more information on the 197 net zero and 95 net zero ready facilities in the Government of Canada portfolio?
So yeah, our website has open data source. So if you go to the Green and Government Center for Green and Government website, there's our results section, and in it links to an open data set, and there it shows our emissions by facility, and so you can take a look at which ones.
Thank you. Is the expectation for each department to fulfill each of the commitments requirements specifically on the biodiversity, or are those more aspirational? Are there some departments that are leading in this area, or any cost estimates for the government as a whole to reach net zero?
So we did do a roll-up study. I'll start with the cost. Well, let me start with the first questions, I guess. The first part of it is, so each department should implement the commitments in the Green and Government strategy. And of course, some commitments will apply to some departments more than others. So if you're a department that doesn't own real property, then of course, your real property commitments, you can't meet the real property commitments since you have no real property. But if you have real property, then you need to implement those commitments. So things like the biodiversity commitments, you should definitely look at them in terms of how do they apply to you. If you have only, let's say, urban buildings, then really it's looking about the urban landscaping section of the biodiversity commitments, right? That you want to look at that. You don't want to hardscape your whole square block. That's in terms of climate resilience, in terms of absorbing rain, et cetera, then that's not a great idea. So think about what applies to you. And then other departments have larger land holdings, et cetera. So it really depends on where you sit as a department. In terms of the cost estimate, so we have done a roll-up study that's done a cost estimate of how it's going to, like we've rolled up departmental studies, if you will. And for the government of Canada, over the 30 years, the estimate is about 3 billion is what it's going to cost over 30 years. Now, if you actually think about that in terms of what it's going to be more in capital, essentially, and save us in O&M, and the net will be about 3 billion over 30 years. If you think of the denominator of how much we spend on real property, we have $100 billion of assets, according to the fixed asset review, and we spend about, I think, 10 billion a year or so. 3 over 30 years is not actually that significant. And again, think about it in terms of putting green into your portfolio planning. And I know a lot of departments don't have funding for their real property, but if you had all the funding you needed for your real property, greening it wouldn't be as big a problem, right? But usually the problem is that we just need to find the resources to manage our real property in the first place. Okay, great. That's great advice. How was that $300 per ton shadow price determined? Is there a methodology available for that? Yeah. So as part of this overall roll-up strategy, we looked at, what would it take to green the harder, the bigger parts of our portfolio. So think of like defense and some of the other major, more complicated buildings. And basically the average price was $300 a ton. So in some cases, in some types of buildings, like for example, office buildings, commercial buildings, the return over the life cycle is actually positive. It's really good. And then other buildings are tougher. I mean, think of a hangar, right? Like these are harder buildings to decarbonize. Laboratories, where there's bigger air exchanges, et cetera. So the price was landed on based on the average cost of decarbonizing the major parts of the federal portfolio. Okay, so good tie-in, because you just mentioned hangars being more difficult to decarbonize. There was a question about airports. How are airports managing in terms of greening requirements? So the greening government strategy applies to all departments, and technically speaking, it's Section 111 and 2 of the Financial Administration Act departments, which is all departments and agencies of the Government of Canada, up until that are sort of, I'll call them normal departments and agencies. So Crown corporations and then shared governance entities. And so an airport is essentially a shared governance entity. It's even more arm's length than a Crown corporation. So the greening government strategy doesn't apply to them strictly. However, the overall Government of Canada in the Paris Agreement applies to them. So airports should aim to be net zero by 2050. And they should aim to meet those. And for Crown corporations, we in the strategy say we encourage them to adopt the greening government strategy or an equivalent set of commitments. And a lot of the airports are doing really neat things. Vancouver, Montreal, et cetera, airports. I think Vancouver is building a wing that's going to be net zero carbon. Montreal's looking at recycling, reusing cement, Montreal Airport. And Canada Post just came out with their sustainability strategy to be net zero as well. So they're moving, and lots of neat things happening in those entities. Interesting. That I guess there'll be more to follow as far as how they manage. So very interesting. Another question was someone noticing that your carbon zero waterfall divestiture seems to get us to 2%. And wondering if there isn't some potential to squeeze some more out of there. Yeah, in terms of divestiture. So, and that was just an estimate. And I think, it depends again on the asset category class, right? So like obviously in things like office buildings, we might think about it differently than something like prisons, right? Or border posts. So it depends on the asset class, really, how much divestiture is gonna get us there. But of course, the first principle in environmental management, if you will, is do you really need something? And if you don't really need something, then don't build it, or don't have it, or sell it so it can be reused and repurposed for something else. So we don't want to, if you can maximize existing resources, that's a lot better, of course, than building new resources that are underutilized. If you think of a highway, it's used at peak hours. It's used at its peak capacity 6 hours a day. And the rest of the day, it's used at less than peak capacity. So should we build more highways? Good question, right? Considering that. So similar with buildings, Our office buildings are used 9 to 5, and some folks will say at 60% capacity. And so really, is that a smart way to use our infrastructure? So we need to think about those things.
And we've got a good start on thinking about those things. How will we get carbon neutral on leasing if the market isn't available in remote areas?
So most of our leases are office buildings. About I don't know the exact stat, but almost over 90% are basically of our leases are office buildings. So really, and our offices are mostly in the large centers. So again, think of the 80-20 rule. When we're leasing buildings, we're often leasing in the 8 biggest cities in Canada, and so for the small percentage of offices we lease in smaller Canadian cities, I would say, let's get the big cities done. Let's get the big stuff done first, and then we can think about what our options are in the smaller jurisdictions, and smaller cities. But it's a good thing to start the conversation everywhere with our landlords to say, hey, we're heading in this direction. We all need to head in this direction, or else the impacts of climate change will be a much bigger problem than trying to change our heating system in a building. And so what's your plan to get to 2050, right?
In some of the remote areas, there may be more challenges with the local cattle than there are with the buildings that the government has in those places. For net zero, that could be a bigger challenge.
There's also, I should say too, you have to think about that the government of Canada is also investing in a lot of different areas in climate change. And so they're investing through CERNAC in northern and Indigenous communities to get to help to invest in getting to zero carbon. We're investing in different programs, different infrastructure programs, Infrastructure Canada, et cetera, across the country. So this isn't like through our buildings is just one vehicle in terms of how we get there. The Net Zero Accelerator Fund is an $8 billion fund for industry to get to zero carbon. So again, steel, cement, and other industries are applying to that to lower the carbon content of their products, right? So we're doing this in conjunction because the whole world is moving on this.
Excellent. Have you had the opportunity to have any discussion with grid operators, LDCs, about carbon reductions via the demand response maneuvers as seen in the Grid Interactive Efficient Buildings?
So we've talked to electricity providers. So like we're talking to Nova Scotia Power, we're talking to SaskPower, et cetera, about buying clean electricity in those provinces. And of course, in some cases, our big bases and our big campuses and stuff we can go further, right? And work with the providers, utility providers to say, okay, well, as things move forward, the whole idea of storage, the whole idea of time of use, all that kind of stuff, that's all good discussion to have with providers. But we have been focused more on the utility providers in the big provinces where the grid isn't zero carbon. But happy to encourage departments to discuss with their more specific providers for their facilities.
Okay. The circular economy is becoming even more critical when purchasing commodities and materials. How will this be embedded in the projects?
So the Greening Government Strategy in the procurement section says we need to aim for a zero carbon and circular economy. Circular economy is really important. So, back in the old days when there wasn't a lot of people on the planet, cutting down trees, making a desk, and then throwing really valuable wood in the garbage might have seemed okay. But nowadays, 8 billion people later, you want to cut trees, build a desk, reuse the desk as often as you can, repurpose the desk, and then once it reaches end of life, reuse the wood for other products, and never take valuable wood and throw it in the waste heap. So that stands across all kinds of things we do, whether it's construction materials, whether it's textiles, whether it's IT, whether it's whatever. We need to figure out a way to make it circular and not linear like in the old days, where in the old days we just use a lot of resources, use things too short a time, and then we have a lot of waste that we got to manage that also produces a lot of GHGs. So we need to do it differently. And I think in each section of things we buy, we need to engage and work with our suppliers and think about how we can do a better job there.
True. Is there in disaster resilience and the impact on emissions due to recovery and repair of infrastructure accounted for in the LCA and net zero assessment? Are you able to comment on how resiliency and emissions considered in a holistic planning decision-making approach?
Well, I think every building is going to be a bit different, right? So, I think the onus is on the building owners to think about what's the optimal solution for their building, right? So, how do you make your building the most resilient possible? How do you make it net zero? How do you make your operations, like, you don't want 4 people at Treasury Board to make decisions on every type of building. You really want to think about your building and your operations and what makes sense for you to make it resilient.
Right.
And we could provide guidance and guidelines generally, but always a good idea to make your building more resilient. Always a good idea to make your operations more resilient. We know what's going to happen. We know there's great modeling on what a 2-degree world looks like. And Canada's already warmed by close to 2 degrees. So the world's warmed by about 1 degree, and Canada's about 2 because we're warming at double the global average. And the North, people in North know this, they're at triple the global average already. So we're seeing the impacts, and you're seeing it probably in your repairs and work you're doing. So you need to look at the optimal solution for your building.
Have you seen an increase in the heating and cooling emissions related to the increase in outdoor air intake to satisfy the COVID-19 protocols?
Yeah, so it's interesting what COVID. So I mean, generally speaking, with climate change, what we're seeing is less heating, more cooling. Okay, as a general rule, but again, the impacts of climate change depend in every part of the country you're in. But that's what we're seeing. So often, actually, buildings that didn't have air conditioning plans, if you will, and were focused heavily on heating, all of a sudden are like, oh, we got to air condition, and we don't know how to do that. And all of a sudden, we got to change our HVAC system. So again, if you're building a new building or doing a major retrofit, you got to build that in right away and think about what your future weather will be like. And then with COVID, what happens, and again, office buildings are different than prisons, than bases, than that kind of thing. So it depends what kind of class of building you're looking at. But in an office building, you have less people in it. So less people heating the building through their natural body heat and everything. But you can also lower the heat if it's an empty building, right? So you might not need it at 21 sort of thing. So it depends really on the situation of the different buildings, but we see it could be in some cases less heating, but it could also be in some cases that some of the buildings still use, so you still need to heat the building, but now you don't have as many people in it. So.
Okay, and I know we have just about 2 more minutes left, so I'll try and squeeze in one last question. Some work is still needed on quantifying embodied assessments for local conditions. When do you anticipate this will start to form part of the analysis for retrofits?
Yeah, so embodied carbon, what we're looking at doing now is, first step is disclosure, right? So what we want is, obviously every cement plant in every region of the country is going to produce cement at a different low carbon rate, if you will, and the different products, whether it's cement, steel, or anything else, will have different carbon content. We're working with the industry and National Research Council on the LCA2 project, it's called, and that project is looking at getting the data on, and we're calling it we call it EPDs, so environmental product disclosure. So to get basically the greenhouse gas global warming potential of each kind of product, that would be declared in an EPD. So when we ask for a lower carbon something, we can compare the EPDs and the data so that you guys can make an easier decision on what's low carbon, right? Because otherwise it becomes difficult and you're kind of guessing.
Okay, you did that fantastically right under the wire of the timing that we had left. So I want to say merci pour tous pour notre participation. We had a lot of questions. Thank you very much, and thank you so much, Nick, for this presentation. And I invite everyone to come back for the final wrap up at the concurrent session later in the day, where all the presenters in this stream will be available for a small short panel. Thanks again, and enjoy the rest of the sessions today. Thanks, Nick.
Merci beaucoup. Thank you.